There it is, Article 2, Section 4, impeachment. Some framers of the Constitution didn't want it in there. Others did. The others won. Impeachment always begins in the House of Representatives. A simple majority decides to impeach. If that happens, it's up to the U.S. Senate to try the case. To convict, a two-thirds vote, 67 senators in all, must agree. If that happens, the president is out. Vice president is in. But that has never happened. The House voted to impeach two presidents, Andrew Johnson in 1868 and Bill Clinton in 1998, but the Senate acquitted both. Richard Nixon was facing almost certain impeachment in 1974 when he resigned. And while presidents have escaped official removal, some judges haven't been so fortunate. Congress has forced 8 out in its history. The last time, 2010, when the Senate, by an overwhelming majority, voted to remove Judge G. Thomas Porteous from the federal bench.